Thank you for listening to Taking Up Space. We would like to emphasize that taking up space is not a substitute for speaking with a licensed therapist or physician. We hope to encourage discussion around the topics brought up throughout the show. The views and opinions expressed are the speaker's own. We can only speak from our perspective, and we encourage you, as our audience, to listen to all of the perspectives shared here with an open mind and heart, and then form your own. The content discussed in this episode may be troublesome for people to hear. Before, during, and after listening to the episode, please make sure to practice some self-care activities, however that looks for you. Some of our favorite methods here at Taking Up Space include journaling, going for a walk, connecting with a loved one, eating a good meal, or just taking a few deep breaths and some time for ourselves. If you find yourself in any distress after this episode, please contact a licensed clinician or a crisis line for support. If you need any help connecting to crisis supports, we do have information listed on our website, BIPOChealingcenter.ca. Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us on our next episode of Taking Up Space. As usual, you have me, Crystal, Reena, our wonderful founder, and Rehana in the studio. And today we have a special guest with us, one of our clinic's very own, Mahnum Iqbal. We hope that you enjoyed this episode.
Hi, my name is Mahnum Iqbal, and I'm a provisional psychologist. I graduated with my master's degree in clinical counseling psychology from University in Georgia in the US. So I was there for about 2 years, and then before that I was actually here, and I graduated with my bachelor's in psychology from the U of A. And in terms of what made me choose this career, psychology is something I've always been inclined towards, and although initially I was gonna go the med route, but even then I wanted to do psychiatry at the end. But I realized while taking those biopsych courses back in U of A that, it wasn't for me, and that I didn't wanna do that and only to do psychiatry at the very end, and I'd rather graduate and start learning about and doing, what I love. So I'm very, very happy with that decision, very happy with what I do now. And something else that kind of always drew me towards, mental health and psychology is, it's so stigmatized being a Pakistani Canadian. It's not something that's talked about a lot in our cultures, and there's such a lack of representation in this field. So I really wanted to be, as a person of color, I wanted to contribute towards this field and promote positive mental health and reduce stigma. Maybe, be a therapist that a younger me would have been very comfortable around and with.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Mahnam. I think it's so nice to see how passionate about you are in this field, and it's interesting to know the experiences that you had in your education and everything. Before we get started in the rest of the podcast, I just wanted to confirm your pronouns and also your cultural background, if that's something you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, so my pronouns are she, her. And as for my cultural background, I am Pakistani Canadian. I was born in Lahore in Pakistan, and then I moved to Toronto when I was about 3 years old. And then we lived there for 7 years, and then we moved to Edmonton since probably, I don't know the math, but around grade 3. And I've been here since then. And that's kind of also why, for my master's, I decided to go out of the country for a bit because I was like, well, I've grown up here. I wanted some different exposure and, gathering different experiences. But I always knew I wanted to come back home.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that.
So, you mentioned that you're Pakistani Canadian, and as most of us know, in any BIPOC community, therapy isn't always the most welcomed or talked about subject, even. And you did also mention that you were interested in med school first, so I'm just wondering, how did your family react when you went from medicine to therapy? Because I've had conversations like that with my parents, and it hasn't always gone so well. So just wondering how
That's a
family and community support.
Very good question. I think that just growing up, the whole reason med school was probably on my mind in the first place was because of those expectations, or, where you hear growing up, oh, the ideal career would be doctor. So I think maybe it was that although I wanted to do psychology, I kind of made it fit with, oh, doctor, so psychiatry, it would work for me. You know what I mean? Trying to push what we both want into one. But yeah, when I realized that this is actually what I want to do instead, and really go towards the master's route instead of
and not do medicine. It was a conversation, but I'm really grateful because I have a really good relationship with my parents, especially my dad. We're really close, and I'm able to share things with him without any, fear or things like that. So I knew that if I was able to present like an actual argument, and by argument I mean if what I was kind of pushing actually had good like facts behind it, and I was able to present my side with like, actual good reasons, they would be willing to hear me out. And although it was a change and they had to kind of shift their mindset as well, they couldn't argue against like my reasons, right? Because it's a good field. It is healthcare. You're helping people, and they could also see how passionate I was about it. That being said, now that I think back to it, what they knew at that time about psychology and therapy really wasn't much at all. So now that I'm reflecting on it, I'm like, wow, they really did just go off of like, okay, I guess my arguments were trusting her, because it's been really cool to see them grow as well in terms of their mindset and what they know about therapy as I've grown. Like, as they've learned things from me as I've been, doing my master's and then seeing clients. So now I hear them say things that I never thought they would say. Like they'll be talking about therapy to their friends, or they're like, I'll hear the words mental health come out of their mouth, and I'll be like, wait, oh my God, that's so cool. Where like, and it's really because as I've been growing as a professional in this field, they've also been learning from me. And that's so cool to see that change in their mindset, because it definitely was, again, really new to them at that time too, when I was introducing it to them. So I'm not saying that at that time they knew that like the value of this career or why it's important. It was more just going off of, okay, like, what I'm saying, we can't force her. Like I had good arguments, I got into a good school, so let's just do it. And then I think as I was doing it and as they saw me like grow, that's when it actually clicked for them that, oh wait, this was actually maybe not a bad idea. Like if that makes sense.
No, that completely makes sense. And first, I mean, it's incredible to hear that you had such a like loving relationship with your parents where they did just trust you to make that decision for yourself.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
But like I still want to be authentic about this, and for people listening, like it wasn't as easy as it sounds. Like although I do have a good relationship with my dad where I was able to at least have that conversation and I wasn't afraid to have that conversation, it was still a shift. Like it wasn't just one conversation. It still took some time. It still took like a few conversations. It was still them having to shift their mindset. But it did help that they were willing to at least listen.
Of course. And
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point that you brought up, is that you just have to be willing to have a bit of an open mind,
Yes.
right? If you have a bit of an open mind, then there's so many new things that we learn about and we hear about. And that was such a big part of the BIPOC community. And I think such a big part of the center is just that community discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, you talked to your parents about this, and obviously they're
Had a pro and cons list. I actually did. There was medicine on one side, what I wanted to do on one side. So that's what I mean, where I really thought about it. And I was like, okay, these are my reasons. So I feel like it really goes back to that, having that discussion and having like really being passionate about what you're doing and having those reasons.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And like you said, now, your parents are talking to their friends about mental health, and we're talking about a generation that
Exactly.
mental health didn't exist so many years ago, right? Like even if you look at the fields of psychology and neuroscience, these are relatively very new fields in science and in medicine. So that's great to hear. I'm really glad that you were able to go through that journey with them, and now you're in this field, in this career that you love. And I think with that, I think this is a really good time, Reena, if you want to talk about your experience first meeting Mahnum and how all of that went, and kind of what maybe you look for in a therapist or in a clinician that you're hiring to the center.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times what I notice with like folks being drawn to apply at the center is there's like a personal connection to the cause, as well as like a passion professionally. So even what like Mahnum was describing there with like essentially like this cultural normalization of prestige within certain fields versus other fields, more kind of awareness regarding healthcare, but not as much awareness towards mental health. That those are very important lived experiences that a lot of folks can really relate to within different cultural communities. And so really a lot of the times, like what I'm looking for is like who the person is, like bringing their whole authentic self with them into like meeting with me and sharing why they're passionate about serving our communities. And a lot of times it does come from being like personally driven, from seeing, okay, it was hard for me in some ways. Maybe I had to convince my parents of certain things, or, maybe I come from a collective background where what my parents think like is really important and matters. And a lot of times, within the field of psychology or therapy, there is a lot of like individual focus. That's just kind of the Western model. The medical model of practice is a lot about focusing on the individual, and also how someone can offer like expert knowledge towards the folks that they're working with. And so I really wanted to look for folks who are not gonna have that power over sharing the power and holding people's stories like with them through understanding of like their own lived experiences. So I noticed with Lana, we really bonded about these, like the things that like we had seen as gaps within our own communities, some like, shared experiences, some different experiences, but ultimately we really like talked about how there's a lot of like misinformation out there. There's a lot of gaps in what people know about how to take care of their mental health. We are in a position as kind of like children of immigrants, or as immigrants ourselves, where we're kind of positioned in the middle. We can kind of be this bridge in between these two different worlds. And what would it look like to actually like bring some of this awareness and knowledge to our communities, while also celebrating like the wisdom and the richness within our communities, not dictating what psychology needs to look like for our communities, but also kind of, I guess, like tailoring and adapting it to like what works for our communities based on being in relationships. So I really do look to forge relationships with the people that I'm onboarding at the center, people who really want to like uh, be invested in supporting people like where they're at, and to be seen and heard fully in themselves, and also like in the process of it, like not being afraid to be seen and heard fully in their own selves too. So my interview process is quite like casual and not super formal. It's a lot less about credentials and a lot more about like, tell me like, what matters to you. Like, tell me what you care about. Tell me what you know about the social injustices that our communities face. And, tell me more about like what you want to provide in that, because I've said this like quite a lot of times, like BIPOC Healing and Wellness Center is kind of like this social movement as well, where we're trying to create waves of better access, more tailored access, for there to be representation of people of color in therapy. And so I really was looking for folks who like can kind of like see, maybe like think outside of the box and really see that there's a lot of gaps, and like the systems are not fully working for all of our communities. So people who can really critically think about that and see like, hey, what would it look like if we reimagine and envision a new way and co-construct and create that together in community. And I really saw forward thinking. I get very inspired when I'm interviewing folks, and felt really like drawn to Mahnum in that, where it felt like we had a shared vision. Ultimately, I always look to kind of like those core values of like what we represent. And so I'm really screening folks who align with that, not just folks who come from different cultural backgrounds, but folks who believe that our communities like deserve better, and that we can offer them better, and we can like create what they need.
So what did you think of your first meeting with Reena and hearing about the BIPOC Center and everything like that?
The BIPOC Center, I had actually come across them on online before I was even looking to join another place. But once the time was right in my life where I was looking, it was one of the first places that popped into my mind, because I remember their posts really resonated with me. The fact that there was a space just for people of color to feel safe, and again, combining those two aspects of mental health and then also minority cultures, and then, coming together in one space and a space just for them, it just really resonated with me. And then there were posts where during certain times of crisis around the world, what like there were, with different things, BIPOC took that space to actually say that, hey, like, we're here for anyone struggling right now with this issue or with this or with, whatever's going on. And so to take that space and take that stand and offer that space for vulnerable individuals, it really sat with me. And it was something that I really wanted to be a part of because it's something that I care about so much. And so that's what drew me to BIPOC. And then, like Reena said, we talked for about an hour because we were both so passionate about the conversations that we were having. And it was really about, cultural minorities, the barriers that we face with mental health, even starting from the basics about like not even knowing what mental health is and how much damage that can do, and how, people in our cultures don't tend to take care of their mental health because it's not something that's talked about a lot. And, we just brainstormed ideas of things that would be really cool to start in the future. So it was very energizing to have those conversations, and sometimes it's just like a click because you can tell that someone shares the same, like you said, values as you or shares the same mindset as you. So it really was more just, I know, as cheesy as it sounds, it's because I'm so passionate about this work. And so it just felt like the perfect place because it's the exact same things that mean so much to me.
That's beautiful to hear, and I think, Rehana, I'm gonna speak for you, so let me know if I'm incorrect. But I know even in my first meeting with Reena, there was that click, and I'm sure you experienced it as well. And I think that's one of the best parts about BIPOC as a group and an organization. We all just kind of have that click with each other, right? I know as a volunteer, I barely ever hear in the space physically, but every time I've been here and I've met new clinicians and everyone's just kind of gets along like right away. It's kind of weird, a little freaky, but it's been really, really nice as well.
Yeah, it's really curating this sense of community because, I mean, in order to like do the work for our communities, like wanted us to be rooted in like that community care as well. I've been working in the field for over a decade. There were so many experiences that I had where it was very much like you kind of have to like, check your whole self at the door and just like put on a performance of professionalism that this is what it needs to look like in order to like come to work. And, I really thought about how in order to create safer spaces for really vulnerable folks who otherwise may not access therapy, well, we need to be able to like breathe ourselves and feel safe ourselves and be in an environment where we don't have to like mask and pretend about who we are, as that's kind of part of the whole like colonialism thing is assimilate and be a certain version of yourself so you can kind of serve these systems. So what would it be like if we can just be ourselves and bring different perspectives, right? Like we talked about shared values, but there's also a power in like just different lived experiences and perspectives that don't have to be left behind when you come to work, can actually be integrated and can actually reflect like the perspective that someone else that we're serving may need in caring for their mental health. So, it's really kind of thinking more broadly about what mental health is. It's not just this, kind of individual mind experience. It's so much more about our communities around us, what's happening in the environment and what's happening in the world, because we don't exist in a bubble, and a lot of times like we are impacted by things happening in the world and in our home countries as well.
I think that's a really interesting point that you brought up, Reena, that our mental health is connected to the community, is connected to the world, right? And we see that with everything that's happening in the world right now. We see that with the genocide that's happening in Palestine. We see how that's taking a toll on so many people's mental health outside of Palestine. And I think that kind of comes back to this whole idea of collectivist versus individualistic cultures. And, a lot of us in the BIPOC community are from collectivist cultures where there's this idea that you almost have to put the good of the group before the good of yourself. Like the group comes first. And while that has a lot of benefits, because at the end of the day, we are all humans, we're all connected to each other, right? With the human race wouldn't survive without us helping each other. But then there also comes this aspect of, is self-care being selfish? Like, why should I take that time to kind of take care of my mental health and sit with myself and journal and do this when I could be volunteering, I could be doing something to help the community? And there is a lot of power and a lot of benefit to our mental health from volunteering and to giving to our communities. And I know a lot of us feel better when we spend time with our communities, even, when you're sad and you just go for a coffee with a friend, or you take some time out to volunteer. And there's a lot of benefit in that as well. But I don't know, I feel like there kind of needs to be some balance. But Monum, what do you think about all of this?
I think that that's a very key point when we talk about mental health in minority cultures, and why it's not something that's given more attention to, because it's definitely all about balance. So in our cultures, they're most likely, most of our cultures are collectivist cultures, where we're always focused on taking care of our families, doing the most for the people around us. So then when someone goes to therapy and the therapist is telling them to set just set boundaries, or if you're having too many arguments with your parents, move out, like those aren't feasible solutions, and those aren't things that work for us. Those aren't things that we need to hear. And I think that's why it's so important to go to culturally sensitive therapists, because they understand, and they understand how to balance that individualism with collectivism. Because although we are from collectivist cultures, we're also now living in the Western world where it's all individualism. And I think both sides can be harmful, like whether it's too much of individualism and we're just doing only boundaries, or we're just focusing on ourselves, especially as a first generation immigrant or second generation immigrant, that feels selfish to us. We're just focusing on ourselves. But then when we're doing too much of just focusing on our families, that's where our burnout comes in. That's where anxiety or depression manifests. So going to culturally sensitive therapists can help us kind of find that balance between taking care of our families, because that's also a part of our culture, a part of our values, and it doesn't have to be demonized. So taking care of our families, not moving out, but working through healthy conversations with our parents, or maybe setting boundaries in a way that's not disrespectful in our families, and like those specific ways to navigate these cultural issues that aren't just based on the Western ideologies of individualism.
So then, going off of that, you've mentioned culturally sensitive therapists, and I know a lot of us in this room, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners feel a need for a culturally sensitive therapist. But what else would you say that somebody should look for in a clinician, right? Like, what are those kind of check boxes that your clinician should hit for you?
That's a very good question. And as a therapist, like going into this conversation, I do want to take the time to say that if you go to a therapist and you have a bad experience, or you feel like, there was no click, it wasn't for you, like the first thing I want to say about this is it's not therapy. It's never therapy. It's most likely the therapist, the experience that you've had. Don't blame it on, therapy or psychology. It's most likely just that connection with the therapist, or the therapist wasn't the right fit for you. So just always give therapy another chance and maybe try someone else. And then going off of that, as a therapist, I know that I want what's best for my clients. So if I have a client and for whatever reason, maybe something that they're struggling with, they're not able to find me helpful for that area, I'm never going to be offended, or I'm never going to be, take it personally if they have that conversation with me, or even if they don't have that conversation, but they want to switch therapists. Like, because I think that's a thing that maybe people are hesitant about, and they're like maybe forced to continue going to therapy with someone that they don't feel like is a good fit for whatever they're struggling through. So most likely as a therapist, our priority is our clients, and we want the best for them, even if it's not with us. So as like if someone is struggling with something that I can't be helpful for them with, like I would be so happy if they actually brought that up to me and they were like, you know what, I'm at a place where I feel like I want to maybe try a different therapist. I know it's an intimidating conversation to have, but I'm hoping me saying this might bring some ease to people who might be in this situation, that we want what's best for you. So if you want to try someone else, or see if there's someone else that's a better fit, please go for it, because your mental health is what matters most. And I know I kind of swayed from the original question, but that was something important that I felt like I wanted to kind of prioritize and also have a conversation about. But as for what you want to seek in a therapist, I think that it's important to recognize that therapeutic fit is important. So you want someone that you're going to be able to feel comfortable with, because therapy is meant to be that space where you can say whatever it is that you need to say, talk about whatever it is that you need to talk about, with that confidence of knowing that it's not going anywhere else. And this person that I'm confiding in it's going to be a safe space for me. So off the bat, anyone that makes you feel judged, or that you feel like you're not able to be your authentic self in front of, you feel like, maybe you're getting a few like expressions that are making you uncomfortable, or even as a person of color, if you're experiencing any microaggressions in therapy, or maybe you're bringing up something that's cultural and they're not responding the way that you would like, and it doesn't seem, or maybe they're seeming too biased about a certain situation, or even if you feel uncomfortable because your political opinions are just different and it's coming out in therapy, those are all areas where it could be beneficial to see if you can find a therapist that's a better fit.
Yeah, I really wanted to add that like the relationship is so central to the therapeutic process, because a lot of times what impacts our mental health is, you know, disconnection or harm that we've experienced within maybe like relationships with family members, or with people in our life. And so a lot of healing can really happen within the therapeutic relationship. So even with like our therapists here at the center, we really like, that's an approach that we really center and honor, is like being very relational, where we want we do want like folks to be with the right fit for them, and we want to be able to like tailor and customize like what works for them, and kind of create a space where people know that they're going to be met with like warmth and compassion, and that we're not going to be kind of enforcing certain rigid guidelines or parameters. Like, we're not here to police or manage people for them. Like, we're here to really create like an authentic, like powerful, open space where like people can be human, and we can be human with them, and we can, show them that like they deserve to be treated with like kindness and respect. And that can create emotionally reparative experiences for people, where they're like, okay, I was really invalidated by my family, but then when I talked to my therapist about this, I got a lot of validation. And that's really like, something healing, because the invalidation that I experienced was blocking me from trusting myself. And through the power of getting like seen and heard by my therapist, it really helped me to connect with like, yeah, I do have this internal wisdom. I can trust myself. So really like, I would say that like a lot of times, like what to look out for would be kind of like a power dynamic, power over, where like if you don't feel like you're being centered as the expert with your own wisdom, as the one who knows yourself best, then maybe that's like not a space for you. If you feel like you're kind of being discredited in your like awareness and authenticity about yourself, maybe that's not super supportive. And that's not to say that as therapists we don't like, challenge people. We do want to offer perspectives or thoughts or insights that folks may not have considered, that could be new for them. But I find it can be so helpful if we offer these things as like suggestions, or a way where people can be empowered to be able to be like, yeah, that fits for me, or no, that actually, that's not my experience. So never something that is like scriptive that we're putting onto people as like, this must be your experience, but really invitational, essentially. And so just knowing that like coming to therapy is about your opportunity to explore yourself and explore the world around you and what that means to you. And it does need to be done within the base of a really good relationship where you can experience healing. So it's also okay to consider like, what kind of person could be really healing for me? Like, do I need someone who's like really gentle and soft and kind to me? Do I need someone who's more like direct and will kind of like tell me things like straight up? Like, what do I actually need? And sometimes we don't know, and that's okay to not know, but that's, the process of kind of figuring out what we need and kind of like trusting yourself in that process, that like you don't have to give up on therapy. You can just kind of move in different directions based on where you're at in your life and your mental health.
I think that was such an interesting point that you brought up about there is that balance between your therapist trying to challenge you, and there are going to be new things that they will show you or new skills that they want to teach you, but at the same time I think what it comes down to is that feeling of discomfort. So even when it is your therapist introducing you to new skills, it's never supposed to feel like it's being enforced upon you, but more like you said, kind of like a suggestion, just checking in if this really is something that you're going to be okay doing, if it's something you're going to be comfortable doing. But if you ever feel that feeling of just discomfort in therapy, coming from specifically the therapist enforcing you or forcing things upon you, maybe that's a good sign that I need to maybe check in with someone else. And I do want to also kind of take time to say that therapy can be uncomfortable. So when I say discomfort, I don't mean the discomfort of, sharing those deep feelings that we may never have voiced outside of our head before, but the discomfort of just that therapeutic relationship, not feeling right. Because that's also another piece where, when people are like, okay, what do I expect in therapy? That it can be uncomfortable, but that's okay. It's not going to be uncomfortable in a way that's going to be like, ideally, if you have the right fit with your therapist and you're in the right space, not the kind of discomfort that doesn't want you to ever come back or go through that experience again, but more just finally being in a space that you're allowed to feel what you feel. So then those feelings are finally coming beyond the surface. And then you find yourself crying and you may be like, wait, I never even thought this was something that I was so upset about before. I don't know why I'm suddenly crying. And that's because our mind and body just knows at that time that we're in a space where we're finally allowed to feel. Because in our normal lives, we may be in survival mode or we may be just on the go and we're just keep pushing those things that we're struggling with deep down. And so now we finally have a space where we're able to bring them to the surface. So there is some discomfort that is associated with therapy, but it's all very cathartic. So it's all a part of that healing. And you'll be able to feel it. You'll be able to, after that, know that, okay, wait, that actually kind of felt good to get it all out there.
Yeah, that's so true, right? Yeah, I think it's so important to distinguish that kind of discomfort because yeah, like there is some discomfort that we're going to need in order to kind of like move into our growth zone to kind of evolve and continue on the pathway to becoming the version of ourselves that we want. But if we're feeling uneasy with the therapist, it's really important to honor like the feeling in your body. If you feel off like that is important to listen to. I think a lot of folks are really afraid to kind of challenge like authority figures, like and therapists can really represent that power of like, okay, there's this like trained professional who's saying something that I don't really agree with, but like maybe they should know better than me. And so I think a lot of folks like really experience that challenge of like, it's really scary to kind of push back and maybe like disagree or recognize that someone's not right for you because I think a lot of times like this has been a survival mechanism for a lot of folks, and especially those of us who come from lineages of like colonization where like we have had people like hijack and take over and prescribe and tell us like who we are and what our culture and background is not right or good enough and this is the way instead. And so I can see how therapy can continue to perpetuate these cycles of colonial trauma. And so just know that as like a racialized person in culturally sensitive therapy, like, what we're trying to do is to decolonize. Like we're not trying to like create these continued cycles of harm for folks. to then be like told and prescribed what is best for them. That's actually the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. And so you're allowed to look for a therapist who is actively doing that work to unlearn and undo those things and to meet you where you're at. And unfortunately, like, there may not always be that approach. You may encounter a therapist who is really power over. And I do hope that that continues to change and evolve in the field. And that's what we're hoping to do, is to really promote this idea that like you can have autonomy and power over your own healing journey. It's yours, and you're allowed to have the right person on that journey with you.
I think a good go-to, like just to know that you're with someone that's the right fit for you, is just knowing that you can say whatever it is that you want to say, even if it's that saying that, this is not for me, or this is not something I'm comfortable with. So when you know that with your therapist, you can just share anything or any opinion that you have comfortably with them, even if it's something that they've talked about, and you can let them know that, hey, like that's not, that's what I'm feeling about this. I think that's a good sign that that person's the right fit for you.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I know, like, some people, especially when we've experienced like relational trauma, where we've been like criticized or really like hurt by the people who we were trusting to share our vulnerability with, it can be so hard to be like open and honest and vulnerable, like even with your therapist. So I want to also name that, like, when you open up, it can be really hard to get to the point of opening up. But the therapeutic relationship can give you cues of safety, can give you like some signals of like, okay, maybe it's okay if I open up here. Maybe I can try it. And then if you try it and you feel like, oh, like that was a really good response, like I got supported in a good way, that's a really good sign that, okay, like I said what I needed to say. It was really hard and scary to say it. And the way I was responded to was like really like helpful. And if it's not, then like a therapist should also be open to that feedback of like, okay, like that wasn't actually helpful for me. And so a sign of like a good therapist for you is someone who's really willing to kind of like work through those things to give you the support that you need. But if you put yourself out there and are vulnerable and you get hurt in that, that can make it so hard to then like want like be able to trust that person again or want to go back to therapy. So I do want to name, like, that is okay if that's the experience where you're like, okay, like I tried with a therapist and they really hurt me. It's understandable that you're hesitating to go back. And what could be really healing is someone responding to you in that thing in a different way, in a better way. And you deserve that. You don't deserve to be like hurt or treated in a way that's not helpful for your healing. So that's why we've kind of emphasized like being able to try again is scary and a big step, but can be a healing step too.
Thanks so much for bringing that up, Rena. I think that's such an important message to share with everyone, because like I know that there might be some people who kind of have that fear of like being judged or like ashamed in therapy, and that's really not the purpose of therapy. I can totally see people, being afraid of sitting down like on a couch with their therapist and then being like kind of like evaluated with their therapist kind of like sitting there with a checkboard checking things off like, okay, this is what's wrong with you. But that's really not how the therapeutic relationship works at all. I think you really summarized it in such a beautiful way, where it's meant to be a very like healing and sacred relationship between the client and the therapist. And that kind of like leads me into my question for you, Mahnum, about like who would you say therapy is for?
Everyone. I think that absolutely everyone can benefit from therapy. And we need to see it more as not just some place to go when we're in crisis mode, although it can be obviously very helpful at that time too. But it's not only for times when you're struggling with very deep, mood disorders or depression or anxiety, but also as a preventative form of help and care, or to prevent you from getting to that point. So that being said, then therapy can benefit absolutely everyone, like all ages, all backgrounds, whether it's, just having someone to have a safe space for, just to share, everyday things that are going on, relationship struggles, or, whether it's school or just anything going on with your life and you need just a space to get it out. And also maybe learn skills to navigate those challenges in a healthy way. It could be helpful for that. It can help you discover yourself really on your own, healing journey, your self growth journey, building healthy habits, getting rid of maybe some of those unhealthy habits. That's what therapy can be helpful for. It can help build your self-esteem and confidence if that's what you want to work on. So it's so versatile, it's so personal, like whatever it is that you're either struggling with, or even something that you want to build and incorporate with in your life, but you want to maybe have some guidance on, okay, I know this is somewhere I want to be, or this is the goals that I envision myself fulfilling. How do I do that? And, having guidance on like that journey. So a therapist is going to help. They may not be, it's not that we're going to, magically solve all your problems for you, but we're going to, like, I like to give that example that it's someone holding your hand as you navigate those challenges. So you're not alone. And then not only is it a place where you're going to be able to talk about these things, but then also learn and incorporate skills that you maybe didn't know about before. And like just make that be a way of life for you. Yeah. And I think another piece that just came to mind with this, especially in relation to us and this specific population, is a lot of those intergenerational traumas that have been passed on that we don't realize, that, breaking those unhealthy chains, it can be really helpful because sometimes we're not able to see where those patterns are in our life, as and a therapist can better help point that out, that maybe this unhelpful pattern in your life is something that can use some change, and this is how we can work on that.
That's such a great point. It's like sometimes like when we're like really in our head about things, like it's hard to kind of zoom out and then see that perspective of like where these patterns show up in our life. And especially from an intergenerational perspective, like dealing with generational trauma and historical trauma, like sometimes it's hard to see like the connection between those. And I can totally see how, like, as a therapist who's trained to see these patterns, like, it can really put things into perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I think that sometimes there's that stigma with going to therapy that it means that there's something wrong with me, right? And that's why a lot of people maybe don't take that step and don't look into it. It's like that whole thing about, I don't want to be seen as weak. There's nothing wrong with me. Why should I go to therapy?
Right.
But that's where I want to say that that going to therapy does not mean that there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
And that's a narrative that's been pushed out there that's just so untrue. So therapy doesn't mean that, there's something wrong with you, more that you're just working on yourself, which is what everyone is doing, but you're actually able to seek help and guidance and learn skills that you may not be able to otherwise. So it's kind of taking away that shame aspect from going to therapy, right?
Yeah. That's such a great point too. Like there is like that shame that some people might have about like, okay, like if I even like telling someone, oh, I'm going to therapy, like it could be like it could bring up that like, okay, now they're gonna think that like something is wrong with me, like exactly what you said, whereas it's like it's just really a part of your like self discovery, just like how you said. Yeah.
Like think about it. If you had like a very bad fever or flu, are you going to be embarrassed to tell someone that, oh, I'm going to go to the doctor on Monday? Have a doctor's appointment, right? Like I think that's how we need to think of it when we tell, like, and not that you have to tell people that you're going to therapy, but just that mindset of, why is it embarrassing? Or why is there that shame aspect of going to therapy where we can just easily say that, oh, I have a doctor's appointment? Because mental health is the same as physical health. The only difference is that we can't see it. And I think that's where a lot of that those narratives come into, with the shame and the embarrassment, or even where just the lack of understanding. I think it's a lot like maybe because we can't see that part of ourselves, or other people can't see exactly how sick or how hurting you are, whereas they can see, the runny nose or hear the coughing.
That's so true. Yeah, like it's such a parallel almost where it's like, okay, here's like what your physical health conditions are and how to seek support for that, and it's completely normal. But then when it comes to mental health, it's like, how come there is still that, like, we're still working through that like stigma against those things. So yeah, it actually brought up a thought for myself, like even just kind of like sharing like my own personal experience with therapy, because like I remember like starting therapy like around 4 or 5 years ago, and like it reminded me of what you said about like how, like, things won't be magically solved by your therapist. Now that I'm like 5 years in, I'm like looking back, like I was a completely different person from like before I started therapy until now. Like it was like the commitment to therapy and like the gradual changes that happen, like even just like inside of myself. Like I noticed learning how to name like what I was feeling, and like having like that space, like how you said, that space to like process like what I was going through, because like I think a lot of other people might also share this, but it's like when else do you get that to yourself? Like when else do you get a chance to like put aside an hour where you have a professional that's working with you to like really understand like what you're feeling and what you're experiencing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I think that's so interesting that you brought that up, because you're right. Like, when else do you have that time where it's just for you? But I feel like people can think that it's selfish because, like, to take that 1 hour for themselves and just talk about themselves.
Right.
And I like to say to that you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a statement that's so helpful with our communities, with that collectivist culture and that individualism at the same time. I think that's what we need to kind of fall back on when taking care of ourselves and feeling like we're being selfish with that, is the more you take care of yourself or do set some time aside for yourself, whether it's through therapy or something else, the better you're going to be able to then go back and take care of the people around you or fulfill your responsibilities, whether it's at work or at home. And so I think that's a good way to look at that, when if you may be hesitating about taking that 1 hour to talk about just yourself, because I do know that's what people sometimes feel is just like, okay, well, that's being selfish.
Yeah, that's so true. And like it it can definitely, I can see how like, people kind of feel that shame about like, okay, like if I'm taking this time for myself, like, I could be helping others, I could be engaging in like, other things, like getting involved in the community. Like part of helping yourself is also going to be like doing a service to other people in your life, like your friends and your family, who like you would probably be able to show up for in a better capacity, like if you are taking care of yourself in those moments.
I often think about how, like, with taking care of ourselves, so many of us watched like the elders in our families not have the chance to take care of themselves, right? Like, so many of us, like, who are like first generation or second generation immigrants, we saw our parents really like kind of working hard to survive. I think for a lot of racialized communities, it's been about survival. Like, how do I just like get through and, make sure that my like family is taken care of? Or, how do I just survive this world with all of these challenges? So, really, like being able to take care of their mental health, was just like not accessible. Like, taking care of our mental health is such a privilege that not a lot of us like are like awarded the opportunities. And so I think that like often I really like view it for myself in my own mental health journey, is that like when I'm taking care of me and my mental health, and when I'm falling into those patterns of like, oh, I need to like serve the community, like, the entire work that we do here is serving our community. So, we're not immune to that. We can fall into those patterns of like, okay, everyone else before me. But then I try to think of it as like, when I can focus on caring for me, I'm actually honoring my mother, my father, my grandmother, my ancestors. Like, I'm doing what folks before me couldn't do because they were dealing with the impacts of colonization or dealing with the immigration journey or, working hard to survive. And so a lot of like those sacrifices have been kind of made so that I can really like kind of focus on my life and how I can care for me. So I also just want to say to folks that like that can be such like an act of like self-love, but also like love for your like your family and your background, is that like, you can do this for yourself because maybe like folks before you haven't been able to, and that is part of breaking those cycles. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge like how challenging that can be in a world, capitalism and all of that, that really wants us to just, keep going, keep busy and survive. It is an act of resistance when we can put aside time for ourselves to care for us.
I wanted to touch on that point that you made, Reena, about, how our ancestors, they weren't able to focus on their mental health, but because of them, we're able to. And I was once told that everybody in my family worked as much as they did for me to get to the point where I am. And I genuinely believe that that's true for so many of us that have immigrated here, right? We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and all of that resistance that really just courses through our veins and is in our DNA as well. And Mahnum, you talked about this as well, but you can't pour from an empty cup. And so when we talk about taking care of ourselves, it's not just taking care of ourselves. It is that taking care of our community, like you were saying, Reena. It is honoring our ancestors and all of the work that they did. And maybe that's something that I've done, at least, is change my perspective on, taking a moment for myself. I've tried to change that and say, it's not just taking a moment for myself. It's taking a moment, for me, but also to honor my ancestors, but also it's taking a moment for my kids, because I know that when I have kids and when they have kids, all of the work that I've done now is only going to benefit them. So when we take care of ourselves, we are taking care of our communities. And, maybe, I don't know, this is just something that I do to kind of combat that. Self-care is selfish.
Beautiful way to think of it. Like the way that you said that you're actually taking care of, it's a way to take care of the people around you also. And that reminds me of something that I tell my clients, because they brought that up where, well, that sounds like I don't want to just go do something for me. I don't want to go just, read a book or do some painting, because that time could be used elsewhere, because they feel selfish for taking that time, right? So something that we say instead is think of it as fuel for yourself. Mm-hmm. You're not just taking care of yourself, but it's like you're refueling yourself, you're re-energizing yourself so that you can get back to those other things that you feel are more productive. And I say that with quotations.
Yeah.
There's been a lot to think about from this episode, Mahnum. Thank you so much for coming in and joining us, and all of your valuable insight, not just, on this podcast or on the blog, but for all the contributions towards the center and just towards our community itself. Hopefully you enjoyed it and you'd like to come back.
Yeah, for sure. It was really nice to have that space to have this conversation.
Yeah. That's so great having you here.
Mm-hmm. We're all practicing taking up space. So
yes.
That's why we're here. So thank you so much for giving us some space and for sharing your space with us today. Well, thank you. If you are interested in further resources and readings, you can find some content referenced in the episode description. If you come across any content you believe should be shared with our audience, please let us know. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode. We are extremely grateful for your support, and as always, we hope you take up some space however that looks for you.